Hi everyone, welcome. What you see here is a couple bins with African nightcrawler worms living in them. And the reason I keep these bins with worms living in them is because it's a place where I can put my kitchen scraps for the worms to eat, and they produce this really nice material known as vermicompost. And vermicompost is really just a fancy word for worm manure. And the worm manure is just a really awesome stuff to feed your plants. So it's not your traditional kind of everyday fertilizer that you throw on your plants with that, like NPK with the different types of nutrients and different types of amounts. This stuff is really beneficial to your plants from the perspective of all the microorganisms that live in this stuff. It's like whenever the worms eat something and they poop it out, the microorganisms that live in the gut of the worm end up in the poop, in the fertilizer. Well, I mean, we treat it as fertilizer, those of us who produce this stuff for their worms. And then when you give it to your plants, the plants benefit greatly from all the microbes and the fungi and all that other sort of stuff that lives down within the gut of the worm and ends up in their manure. So now these systems with the African night crawlers in them, these have been around for 127 days now. And it's been 15 days since we last checked in on them. The last check-in, we started noticing how stuff in the systems were starting to get a little bit overly damp and clumpy. So to try to counteract what appeared to me to be excess moisture, first thing I did was exclude the plastic coverings. So you saw that the only coverings on these were the newspaper coverings. So that was one thing that I thought would help the systems breathe and allow for some evaporation. The other thing that we did was we included a great deal of just simply dry shredded paper and cardboard down in the feeding area. Now, even though the food that they got, which was a bunch of watermelon rind, was a sort of food that would bring with it a good bit of moisture, the dry shredded paper and cardboard, I believe, would have been more than enough just to not only absorb the moisture of the foods that were being applied, but also hopefully help the system shed some of its moisture into that stuff. So I am curious to see if the stuff is still sitting down here in the bin, dry as the day we put it in here 15 days ago, or has it started absorbing some of the moisture from the surrounding materials. So a lot of chit chat here leading into checking in on the worms without even seeing a single worm yet. So I'm curious to see how the feeding area is doing in these systems. Sometimes when I dig in to a section where I had applied a whole bunch of this shredded paper and cardboard, I find pockets of this stuff just sitting there dry still, but here the stuff all feels quite damp. So I'd like to think that the stuff has done its job to a certain degree to suck in some of the moisture from the surrounding materials. And between that and the allowance of evaporation by excluding the plastic coverings, my hope is that we've allowed the system to reach a moisture level that's sort of in balance, because the worms definitely need a material that's fairly damp for them to be comfortable. Worms breathe through their skin, and unless they're in material that's fairly damp, they're not even able to breathe, so they're going to go looking for something else. But if the stuff in the bin starts to get overly damp, it starts to clump together, it becomes a real nightmare to handle. Not to mention the fact that those big clumps are stuff that the worms really aren't even processing, because it's just sitting there in a lump or a clump versus being nibbled away by the worms. So it does seem to me like, even though we've got a little bit of remaining shredded paper and cardboard from 15 days ago when we put it in here, there's no signs of any of the watermelon rind that we put in here, which is absolutely not surprising whatsoever. That's pretty much to be expected, I believe. when you're giving them a yummy food like that, which they really enjoy. So that feeding zone looked pretty good. Why don't we do the same over here and excavate the feeding zone in this system. Now these two systems were launched on the same day, 127 days ago. And at that time we estimated that the systems had a population somewhere in the neighborhood of, I don't know, almost 1,600 worms. You know, after all those days and weeks, it's usually fair to assume that the worms have been busy reproducing and increasing the initial population size. So while we estimated a population size somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,600 worms, I'd like to think that we've probably got more in here at this point than that. It's hard to tell, really, but it is fair to assume that that's what's going on. Now we haven't even really checked the outskirts of the bin. Perhaps I should have started by not excavating the feeding zone, but rather the outer edges, where I think we'd have a better chance at gauging what the moisture level of the system actually is and whether or not we need to continue adding dry material. So you know what, before we backfill that trench that we just opened up, why don't we just proceed to the examination of the outer edges of the bin too. And at this point, if we do notice that things are maybe a little bit too damp still, just the aeration of the material in the bin will also benefit the system by allowing it to air out a little bit by being aerated. And you know, we'll be surfacing some of the more damp stuff that was sitting down low, blending it in with some of the drier stuff or slightly drier stuff out on the surface. Luckily, these systems are still young enough that there's ample time for a situation that might be seen as overly damp to sort of recover. So I'm starting to get that feeling, just based on what I saw in the material that we just unearthed on that side, that maybe there is a bit more dampness in here still than we would consider to be optimal. I'm sure the worms really enjoy it, and I'm sure it's also helping promote a lot of reproduction, because the worms do tend to reproduce when the conditions are extra damp for them. The only reason we consider the exceeding dampness or excess dampness to be sort of a pitfall in the worm bins is just the manageability of the material. Plus what I mentioned earlier, just the fact that the material clumped up together prevents it from being accessed by worms, and then the stuff just sits there idle, whatever it is that's in the middle of your clump of stuff. It doesn't really get the attention that it deserves from the worms. So I like how every handful of material does have a lot of worms in it, and despite the fact that it's fairly damp, it's luckily crumbling pretty readily. So I guess the other benefit to what we're doing here is that excuse me, perhaps we can take some of this excavated shredded paper and cardboard and begin blending it in with the other materials in the system. So I just took some of the stuff that was piled up over here and threw it over there to blend it with that stuff. We'll do the same in this bin over here. Grab some of these piles of excavated shredded paper and cardboard and get it blended in with the rest of the system. And we got a little worm over here that's not enjoying the very hands-on approach that I'm taking here with examining the contents of the system. Alright, so I guess we should probably just follow suit with what we started there, is just examining the other outskirt of the system over on this side closest to me, and at the same time also blending in some of that shredded paper and cardboard that was down in the feeding area. This way all that shredded paper and cardboard will have been blended in nicely with the entire contents of the bin, and it's not really going to contribute to the absorption of any moisture at this point, because all that shredded paper and cardboard did appear to me like it was pretty much drenched, so no opportunity there to suck in extra moisture using some of that bedding that was applied to the last feeding. But I think that's leading me to the conclusion that perhaps coming in with even a little bit more of that dry shredded paper and cardboard as the foundation for today's feeding might be a good idea. Luckily, I've got a little bit more of it. Last time we were in here 15 days ago to feed, I presented an entire, almost full bucket of this stuff that we made use of, but luckily I've still got a little bit of that remaining, plenty to do this feeding. So I'll go grab that in a moment. But as long as I'm already in the process of tilling up material over here, I'm just going to press on to the point where we've got the gully over here in bin number 2 to apply today's feeding to. And then we can proceed to doing the same over in bin number 1, and then I'll go ahead and fetch that collection of dry bedding materials so that we can give them their feeding. Okay. It does seem to me like the moisture level in both bins is more or less the same. Right from the beginning when I picked the systems up to carry them over to the bench here, I did try to also just get an estimate of how they felt as far as just their weight. A lot of times when I pick up a bin and I feel how heavy it is, it makes me kind of, wonder, hey, why is this thing so heavy? And then usually it's explained away by the fact that there's just a huge quantity of moisture in the system. I mean, they were a little bit heavy, not so ridiculously heavy that, it made me worry. But it did still give me the sense that we might still have excess moisture going on over here. And I think just from examining the contents of the containers, we can still see that there's perhaps a little bit more moisture going on here than would be optimal. So we've got ourselves a nice trench dug in both systems, and just in the process of doing what we've done so far, we've also nicely combined all the material in each system with all that shredded paper and cardboard that had been applied last time. So that stuff's all over the place now, providing the worms with plenty of paper and cardboard to nibble on as they explore the contents of the bin. That stuff won't really be doing much to absorb moisture into itself, but that's fine. What we're going to add now might do a little bit. So let me go grab my bucket that has that stuff in it, and then we could proceed with resetting the feeding zone. Just want to make sure I don't take any little baby worms with me and drop them on the floor. Alright, here's my bucket. As you can see, there's still a good amount of this stuff remaining, luckily. What remains after we tap into it now might actually go into my prepared bedding mixture, because I take this stuff and then I combine it with moisture and I combine it with leaves, and that ends up becoming my prepared bedding material. But it is kind of nice to have this stuff on hand, not moistened or anything like that, just on the ready, dry, in case you need to use it for something like this. And I'm starting to feel like maybe by the next time we come in here to check on these systems, things might be a whole lot better, because I gotta admit, even though I'm sort of describing these systems as being overly damp, they're actually quite nice. The worms would certainly agree with me. They're not going to complain about the excess moisture. My only reason for being concerned about it is that I just don't want to see the material in the bins begin clumping up. I really want to see the material remain nice and flaky and crumbly. And that's, throughout the entire lifespan of the system. So now, a lot of this stuff is frozen together pretty completely, but luckily it's thawing to the point where it's falling apart quite readily as well. Once again, it seems like the moisture that's coming along with this feeding is pretty substantial. In fact, this right here is just almost like a block of ice. What's inside of it is the end of a cucumber. So I'm just trying to divvy out the food in a pretty fair way so that both systems get an equal quantity. And you know, if we wait another 15 days like we did this time, I don't think any of these foods are going to show up as leftovers next time. And you know, even though we're looking to dry things here, this little bit of moisture in the form of ice that's coming along with the food can certainly go in here, no problem. I'm not going to worry about it. So yeah, you'll have to admit that that's not all that big of a feeding, but it's good enough. All that stuff that we're putting in here, the dry material as well, even though it's classified as bedding, the shredded paper and cardboard, it too is obviously worm food as well. It eventually gets eaten by the worms and transformed into vermicompost as well. It's just that in the beginning, when it's still, you know, freshly applied, it's kind of the medium that the worms live in, you know. When you build a new bin, it's pretty much consisting entirely of bedding materials. And then eventually, as it softens up and gets damp, the worms are able to start nibbling on it, and it all gets transformed into worm poop. So things are looking quite nice in these systems. I'd like a little bit less moisture, but I'm definitely not in any sort of a, you know, danger situation here. Things are definitely looking good. Perhaps if things flowed a little bit better, I'd be classifying these as being almost ideal. But I think until we reach that point, I might still continue to try adjusting the moisture levels in these systems to steer them towards somewhat drier conditions, and then I'll be satisfied that what we've got in these is pretty much on the money. But that pretty much brings us to the conclusion of today's feeding. We're just going to come right back in with the same coverings that were in here when we first opened up the systems. We traditionally just use a old coffee filter to indicate where we last fed, and this one, as you can see, is also getting nibbled away by the worms pretty heavily. This one's holding up pretty good. There's only one spot where the worms have been chewing through it quite a bit. And then these are also out here as just sort of top coverings to try to hold down some of the moisture. I mean, we do want to see a little bit of moisture being lost to evaporation, but I believe by having a few layers of paper, you know, one layer, two layer, and then what comes on is almost two layers as well, because it's for the most part overlapped with the exception of the outer edges. So this whole middle section is yet another 2 layers of paper. So trying to get moisture through 4 layers of paper, I guess it will gradually wick through slowly, but this stuff is pretty well protected from drying this way, despite the fact that the material is porous and will allow for some evaporation, but that's that's going to happen pretty slowly. All right, everyone, do we have any worms stuck to my glove? No. Good deal. So I've still got a few things I got to take care of over here, getting cleaned up, put away. I'm not going to waste your time with that, though. That stuff's boring. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.